Now it's on.
The red light's on.
Yeah, now we got it. Alrighty. Well, first, could you give me your full name as it's recorded on your birth certificate? What's your full name?
Full name is George Robert Boesch.
Spell Boesch for me, please.
B-O-E-S-C-H.
Great, great. Did you acquire a nickname when you were in the service?
Not that I'm aware of.
Nothing like that? Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, raised in South Georgia and South Charleston, West Virginia, from the 7th grade. Went back to Georgia to military school, graduated from their military school, and then
What school was that?
Gordon Military College, Barnesville, Georgia. As a military school, it doesn't exist anymore. Gordon is part of the state University of Georgia system now. And then went to Marshall and graduated from Marshall, and then got a master's degree from the University of South Carolina. So,
In what field?
public administration.
What took you into the military?
I was basically a military family. Everybody in my family served. My dad, was in the Second War. My brother had served, not in any war period, but in the Cold War period. And I went to military school. I liked the military, and that was pretty much my intention from the start.
Well, what was your job? What was your MOS or job position?
Well, I accepted regular Army commission, and so I was, commissioned with a career branch of military police. But because that was not a combat arm, I was assigned for a year with Armor Branch as a combat arms assignment, and trained as an armored officer, and then in Vietnam was with the cavalry, which is an armored.
What unit? What cavalry unit were you again? I know you told me
I
earlier.
was in E Troop 17th Cav, part of the 173rd Airborne Brigade.
If I'm not mistaken, were that M551 Sheridans? What kind of vehicle?
Well, I was in 151 Jeeps.
Oh, that's right. You're pulling more of a cavalry.
Right, and we didn't have the heavier units. Now, other Cav units had Jeeps, and then M48 A3 tanks. This was before the Sheridan.
Now, that was your.
That was my combat arm assignment, and then
Your first one, because if I'm not mistaken, you were going to go overseas again in Desert Storm, the Gulf War.
well, that was after years later as reservist here in West Virginia. I was commanding a unit in southern West Virginia that was activated and deployed as part of Desert Storm.
So you did your tour in Vietnam, and how many more years of active duty?
I spent after Vietnam about another year and year and a half, and then I sounds funny, but resigned my regular Army commission, took a reserve commission, and left active duty.
Did you stay in the Guard and Reserves, or did you go inactive?
Well, there was a break, but then I got involved in the reserves after about a 3-year break, and then stayed in the reserves up until retirement.
So when you left active duty, were you a first lieutenant or a captain?
I was captain.
Captain when you left active duty. And did you go back in to the Guard and Reserves as a captain as well?
Yes.
How'd you feel about that, your assignment in Vietnam? I mean, that's kind of a broad question, but positive, negative?
You mean Vietnam or my particular assignment?
I'd say your particular assignment in Vietnam.
Oh, it was fun. I love the Cav. We had very interesting assignments. We ran the roads back and forth, and at night there were several different places that we would pull into to add additional security to their site, and were inside the wire. You didn't, our type of unit didn't spend time outside the wire at night because the vehicles were pretty vulnerable. Generally, we would go out and do a mission during the day and come back in at night. Once or twice we did remain out overnight in a particular area. We would circle the wagons, so to speak, and set up a perimeter defense, and take turns catching a little sleep, and try to get through the darkness back into the light. We sort of owned the light, but they sort of owned the darkness. So,
did you have many combat experiences?
There were a few.
Did you have any of these at night? Any actions at night?
We had, we were involved in some attacks on the sites in which we were part of the perimeter defense. At the LCs that we pulled into at night were attacked several times at night. As far as being outside of a secure area, so to speak, at night, well, I was never involved in a firefight. Was involved in some firefights during the day. Particularly reacting to ambushes of convoys, which was one of our jobs when we were on the highway. And then also we were ambushed, running the roads in a particular area of operations we were assigned to work in.
What area of operations was it again that you generally ran?
I was in the Central Highlands 2 Corps, and pretty much operating between An Khe, Bong Son, Tuiwa, An Khe being up sort of in the Central Highlands, up on the first cut of mountains coming from the coast. And then Bong Son and Tuiwa being towards the coast.
Check your urinals.
I'm fine.
You're good? Alright, she just wanted me to check. Thanks. Sorry.
You're fine. You were saying you just coming up to cut into the Central Highlands?
Pardon?
You're just coming, the area of location was just coming up into the first rise of the Central Highlands?
The first, well, in Vietnam from the coast, they're like 2 steps. You come up to the first rise up in the Central Highlands, and then you have another step up to the higher elevations, which was Pleiku, was in the higher elevations, and you came down through from Pleiku down Highway 19 through the Mang Yang Pass, got you to, the plateau where An Khe was located, and then you, going towards the coast, you went down through An Khe Pass, took you down to the coastal lowlands, where Bongsan and Tuiwa were located.
Well, in the same vein, the same kind of question, did you experience any, what was your job function in the Gulf War?
In the Gulf War, I was a unit commander, commanded a very specialized military police unit called a Prisoner of War Information Center, PWIC for short. There are only two in the existence in the Army, and they're specifically designed to collate and coordinate prisoner records from a number of EPW camps, and that was our, organizational mission. That's not what we ultimately ended up doing.
Well, what unit was this?
This was the 313th Military Police Detachment, PWIC, PWIC, out of Myrtle, West Virginia, which is in Mingo County. Down Myrtle is between Logan and Williamson, in southern West Virginia.
Do you have a recollection of where you operated in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait during the Gulf War?
We were in the area of Dhahran, and that's as opposed to the capital of Riyadh. We were out on the coast, on the Gulf coast there at Khobar.
How did you feel about the enemy? Start with Vietnam first, and then we'll go back to the Gulf War. What were your attitude towards the enemy?
Well, I didn't consider them friends, obviously, but I respected them as soldiers. They were fighting for either what they believed in or what their government told them to believe in and fight for, and that's basically what we were doing.
Well, and the same in the Gulf?
Yeah, very much.
Would you make any differentiation between attitudes towards the Vietnamese enemy versus an Iraq enemy? Anything, maybe your years advanced versus a young man, an older man?
Well, enemy's enemy. Of course, very tremendous differences between the Viet Cong and NVA, and the people they were up against in Southwest Asia. I mean, tremendous cultural differences and of course geographical differences between being in the jungle and the desert.
Tell me about that if you can. That's something that interests me particularly is warfare in the environment. So you're in Vietnam. Can you get much more opposite than Southwest Asia?
Not too much. You've got trees in one place, and you don't have much trees in the other.
You ever noticed anything maybe that would the environment helped you or hindered you in Vietnam, or helped you or hindered you in Saudi Arabia?
Well, terrain and environment are always an aid and a hindrance. No matter where you are, they can work one way in one circumstance and against you in another. So, depending on what we were doing, the cover and concealment provided in Vietnam by the foliage and the jungle were an advantage. chasing them or if they were chasing us, I guess. In the desert environment, of course, I was pretty much in built-up, areas, towns, not that much, out in the actual desert, but, imagining and having talked with people that were, it again was an advantage, in one respect, because you could, you could hide in plain sight in the desert pretty good. But it was also a disadvantage to our equipment and our ability to operate in the sand and that sort of thing.
Did you have any difficulty? Did you have any stories? Remember anything about the dust or the sand of the desert?
Well, it was very dusty.
Hinder your equipment or your morale of your troops, or
of course the dust and the light sand would affect our equipment. Weapons. Had to stay on top of keeping things clean. Also affected our breathing. Some of why I'm sitting here in this facility is a result of the exposure to the light dust that was constantly in the air in Saudi Arabia, breathing.
so that it definitely affected your health. I mean, it's one
yeah, I have breathing problems as a result of that environment. That's not all the things that are wrong with me, but that was one of them.
On the other side, did you have any experiences with, say, dust or mud in Vietnam?
Well, mud on occasion. The monsoons, the rains were, just magnificent. I've never seen it rain like that. The movie Forrest Gump, where he describes it, rain that comes straight up and down, rain that comes sideways, and that was really true. And in the monsoon season, when it would be perfectly warm and sunshine, and then all of a sudden the sky would just open up and you would be deluged. You couldn't stay dry, I guess, unless you were totally inside, something, a house or a building or some sort of structure. Tents helped, but, they'd have a tendency to get soaked and kind of drip on the inside, so.
The roads that you were doing some convoy escort work, asphalt, beat up?
There was, down towards the coast and in Quin Yon area and in the built-up areas we encountered, asphalt. But more typically, they were a dirt base road that then were soaked with oil, to hold down the dust and, to make a service.
So most of the time your 151s are running on some kind of deliberate road, but
Yeah, there was an improved surface.
one of the things about the 151, I mean, would it, in the mud, did it get stuck easier, but then again it also would be easier to get out, is that correct?
Well, they're a pretty good four-wheel drive vehicle, and so they can handle a good bit of mud or adverse travel conditions and still move. But we didn't didn't get off-road too frequently.
Why the Army? Why not the Marines, the Navy, or the Air Force?
The Army was just, my dad was Army, my brother was Army, and so I was Army. In hindsight, I probably would have enjoyed the Air Force more. Try to fly.
Like the idea of flying?
Yeah.
A couple questions that are related to some. I've done some do some research and that are kind of related to projects that I'm interested in. One is I'm interested in officers promoted from the ranks. Did you ever encounter many officers promoted from the ranks, or the very rare exception of officers who later became enlisted? Did you ever encounter those?
Well, actually, I've encountered some of both, and some of the Mustangs, that they're called, that I knew and worked with were very fine, very confident officers, and generally had a strong feeling for the enlisted soldiers. I was enlisted before I became an officer, but I didn't, do it that way. I was joined the National Guard and, served with the National Guard. Went through jump school as an enlisted man and whatever, and then went back to college and was commissioned through ROTC.
So, would you consider yourself a Mustang?
Not in the truest sense of the word, no. But I found that my experience as an enlisted soldier provided a lot of insight and benefit to me as an officer working with enlisted soldiers. I felt like I had a strong identity with them, and I liked soldiers. Sometimes I met some officers that I don't think really liked enlisted people, felt themselves above, the enlisted soldiers, and I never felt that way. At best, I was just first among equals, and I was always comfortable with the enlisted soldiers, and I like to talk with the enlisted soldiers. I like to spend time with the enlisted soldiers. Not that I didn't enjoy being with my, contemporaries, but particular the older NCOs that I encountered in Vietnam. I enjoyed their company and their conversations. I learned a great deal from them.
So you went to basic training then, and enlisted basic training?
Yes, I went through basic training.
Where'd you go?
I went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for basic.
What was the MOS that enlisted
I
guys?
was a combat engineer, demolition, and went to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri for that training, and then went to Fort Benning for jump school, and was my National Guard unit was 16th Special Forces out of Huntington, Company A, was the West Virginia Guard. In fact, my first commander was a Major Pat Romano, who became a full colonel and Chief of Staff of the State Guard and whatever, is also a resident here in this facility with me. We talk frequently, and
You said also that you encountered a few individuals who may have been officers who went back to the enlisted ranks?
Yeah, during Desert Storm, my platoon sergeant with my unit had previously been an officer, and had gone through, I'm not sure whether he went through OCS or whether he was, given a commission in Vietnam, but he had 3 tours in Vietnam and was a highly decorated enlisted man, and then officer, and then got to the age that he couldn't serve any longer as an officer, and so he went back to enlisted rank and was an E7 because he wanted to continue to serve in the reserves, and I was fortunate enough to have him as a detachment sergeant in my unit, and he was a fine man, fine soldier.
A couple other areas that I'm interested in. What's your thoughts? What comments makes you make on the difference between having, what I would say, veteran soldiers versus inexperienced, especially with somebody of your background who had been in Vietnam previously to your Gulf experiences? I'm curious about just what reliance or what abilities veterans can bring. People who've either been to combat before or just been in situations where amongst the rank of the regular troop, they can provide some kind of stability or calmness or knowledge. I'm especially interested in knowing beyond the book sort of skills and knowledge that isn't.
There is a body of knowledge, that's derived from experience, as opposed from the books, so to speak. And soldiers that have come through the ranks or, have had experience in other environments and other situations, have that knowledge to share, and there also is a calmness in the heat of the moment among the, I guess the veterans of previous conflicts. I'm not sure I'm a good example of that, but during
No, but you've been you've been a commander. You've been in a position where, would you say you placed more reliance on soldiers who had previous experience, who were veterans, and that, not veterans in the sense of we're both out of the service now, we're veterans, but while in the service, this gentleman, this corporal or sergeant is...
Yeah, certainly those that have had other experiences involving, I guess, personal danger, and being in those kinds of environments, they have a calmness that they bring to the situation that helps calm the younger kids. It's not good if you see your first sergeant running around in circles screaming, and you didn't see that. Typically, the older soldiers, they didn't necessarily take chances, but they just, you knew they had to get up and be moving to do their job, and they got up and did that. And the fact that they could stand up and walk through a firefight, giving orders and doing those sorts of things, gave strength, I think, to the troops. And helped calm them so that their training took over, and their training overcame their emotion, and they did their job.
Did you ever encounter any foreign nationals in any of your experiences, Vietnam or the Gulf, or even just during the men from Germany or El Salvador, Mexico, or who were actually serving in the U.S. military?
Well, yeah, in Vietnam, of course, I had an interpreter assigned to my platoon, then the second part of my tour, when I was with the military police, I had a national policeman assigned to my detachment in An-Kay that I worked with very closely. We did foot patrols in the village together. And of course then knew other members of the South Vietnamese Army structure there in that area. The district commander was a person that I knew that several times had meals with him in his compound, and likewise he came to ours, and then Desert Storm, I had contact with a number of Saudis, and good people.
If I can ask, I'm going to ask. If you don't feel free not to answer. But how'd you get wounded?
Shrapnel, and from apparently an RPG round.
Was it serious? Hospital?
Serious enough.
Yeah. Life-threatening? Were you on the?
No, I don't think it was life-threatening.
Well, what was it like? I've never been wounded. What was it like to be wounded? What's the sensation other than the pain? Or maybe sometimes I hear it's not even depends. Sometimes there's no pain.
It didn't hurt till later, and but it just kind of happened. Knocked me off my feet, and
During a escort or during a night on the base, or
we were on an operation, on a sweep. Actually, on foot. We had frequently with our unit, they would send us out to a particular area, and we would logger up our vehicles, leave a couple of guards on the vehicles, and the rest of us would get off and sweep through an AO. And that was what we were doing today. That I got injured.
Were you out of action for long and returned to your unit?
A couple weeks.
Couple weeks. When was that? I didn't even ask you what dates of. When was your time in Vietnam?
Actually, I was wounded on May 1st, 1968.
And when were you in Vietnam? From when to when? Did you do two separate tours of Vietnam?
One.
One tour. Two different, an armor unit and an MP assignment.
It was March 68, March 69.
Being wounded, that's pretty huge, but what would you say is your most memorable experience in your entire service? What really sort of the story you want to tell, or the thing that is in your head the most?
Well, I think it has a moral, I suppose, but I guess the most unique thing was when my branch assignment was changing from, the CAV to the military police in Vietnam. of course, I was reassigned from the 173rd Brigade, which was headquartered administratively in K, to the 18th MP Brigade, which was headquartered in Saigon and Long Binh. And so I was packing up all my gear, and when you're in a base camp like that, you have a tendency to acquire things, and they had great deals on sound equipment and stuff. So I had a big tape recorder and speakers and turntable, stuff like that, and other things that you accumulate. So there was more than one duffel bag of stuff to be hauled around, and I was getting all this stuff packed up and, in a situation where it could be, transferred down to Long Binh, where I would be, so I could have it in my quarters. And this old sergeant, came to me and he said, "LT, you don't want to pack up all that stuff and haul it with you. Just leave it here." He said, "We'll get it stored in the corner of the supply room for you and secure it. Pack you a grip and go down and see what you're going to do with you and where you're going to be. And then you can move it from here to there." He said, "Because you could be, of course, K was kind of in the middle of the country, and he said you could be north of here, south of here, you could be anywhere in the country. So wait and figure that out before you pack up." So that seemed to be good advice, and so that's what I did, and I got, of course, down to Saigon and Long Binh, reported in, and they reassigned me to the 16th MP group, which was headquartered in actually a place called Nha Trang, which was north of K on the coast, and then the 16th group reassigned me to B Company 504th MPs, which was in Pleiku, which was west of K, up on the top rung of mountains, if you will. Well, no, I missed a step. They reassigned me to I can't remember the number designation, but a military police battalion that was in Quy Nhon on the coast, who reassigned me to B Company 504th, which was one of their supporting units that was in Pleiku, who reassigned me to the Provost Marshal's office in K. And I end up physically moving my stuff about the equivalent of 3 city blocks from the 173rd area over to the military police area. So the advice of the old soldier not to haul it with me just really turned out to be terrific advice, and really saved me a lot of headaches and aggravation.
This a very appropriate question for you. What was it like to return home? And because you're going to return home twice, Vietnam and the Gulf War. So, if you could juxtapose or tell us about what returning home from Vietnam was like, and maybe comparing it or explaining then coming home from the Gulf War was like.
One, we weren't well received. Particularly when we came home and flying from McCord Air Force Base, where we landed, to Chicago, changed planes to fly into West Virginia. We were country had realized that you don't have to. There's a difference between supporting the troops and supporting the war, which was something I don't think was known very well in the Vietnam years.
Did you feel though a certain gee, I wish they'd done this in '69?
No, I don't think I had that thought. In retrospect, I guess it would have been nice to have been better received, but it is what it is.
Is there anything else you'd like to add? I mean, again, the importance of this is, we're not immortal. We're all going to go sometime, and we want to make sure that, your memories and your thoughts are for posterity. That's why we're going to keep them in the archive down at the college. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I was glad to serve, and I would be glad to serve again.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for your service, and thanks for taking the time to do the interview.
My pleasure.